Hello, and welcome to another Village Torah portion discussion with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. This week's Torah portion is Shoftim. We are in the book of Deuteronomy, and this week's Torah portion features a lot of mitzvot, a lot of commandments that we have actually read elsewhere in the Torah so far. A lot of these are repetitions, stuff from the book of Exodus, elsewhere. We even have chapter 20, all about different laws of battle, of going to war. This week's Torah portion actually concludes with it's seemingly a rather strange, perhaps abstruse law about what happens, and clearly a tragedy, finding a corpse outside of a city. So here is what is going on. Having just mentioned chapter 20, all these different laws of battle, of going to war, we read in the very outset of chapter 21, if in the land that the Lord your God is assigning you to possess, someone slain is found lying in the open, clearly a tragedy. The identity of the slayer not being known, your elders and magistrates shall go out and measure the distances from the corpse to the nearby towns. Already, we are off to a curious, perhaps strange start. Now, clearly, we don't know to whom this murder is attributed to. Something bad has befallen this corpse, but now we're measuring. This is not an expected measure, no pun intended. But this is an unexpected step. Now we continue. The elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall then take a heifer which has never been worked, which is never pulled in a yoke, and the elders of that town shall bring the heifer down to an ever-flowing wadi, which is neither tilled nor sown. There in the wadi they shall break the heifer's neck. Stranger still. The priest's son of Levi shall come forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them for divine service and to pronounce blessing in the name of the Lord. And every lawsuit in case of assault is subject to their ruling, which I will point out, we also see elsewhere in this Torah portion about people bringing their lawsuits, their cases to the Levites. So this is not uncommon, and not only for the book of Deuteronomy, but even in this week's Torah portion, we see that also earlier. Then all the elders of the town nearest to the corpse shall wash their hands over the heifer, whose neck was broken in the wadi. And they shall make this declarations: our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Absolve your people, Israel. This is as you can tell, a very fascinating declaration. Absolve your people, Israel, whom you redeem, Lord, and do not let guilt for the blood of the innocent remain among your people, Israel. What a fascinating declaration. And they will be absolved of blood guilt. Thus you will remove from your midst guilt for the blood of the innocent. Yes, for you will be doing what is right in the sight of the Lord. There are so many questions, so many curiosities we have about this. Of course, the first is, look, we take it, it's an understandable tragedy that this person has died, and we don't know by whose hand they were murdered or slain. We just do not know. So then there's a measurement to see which city is the closest, and then their elders, then it's not enough for them to somehow do some sort of action, but they slaughter a heifer over it, and they wash their hands and make this declaration. It's really particularly fascinating. Nevertheless, they want to be seen as innocent. But clearly, at the same time, they're using that heifer, they're sacrificing that heifer and making this declaration seems to imply perhaps maybe a certain level of guilt. So I want to explore now some early rabbinic texts in the Mishnah that discuss this, and the rabbis have some fascinating insights about this. Now, this is found for those keeping score at home in the 9th chapter of the Mishnah. This is something that was published around the end of the early 3rd centuries of the Common Era. Now, it is an interesting start here, what I'm going to mention, which is if the corpse was found concealed in a pile of stones or hanging on a tree or floating on the surface of the water, the judges would not break the neck of the heifer because it has to be in the land. and not concealed in a pile, lying and not hanging on a tree, in the field and not floating on the surface of water. Okay, so this is, obviously very fascinating in that they're saying, well, there are some exceptions. It has to meet this very particular condition. Now, if the corpse was found close to the border to a city in which the majority of its inhabitants are Gentiles, or close to a city that is without a court, well, then the judges would also not take the step and break this heifer's neck. They measure only to a city that has a rabbinical court with 23 judges. If it is found precisely between two cities. Now, I read off what we see in the 21st chapter of Deuteronomy in our Torah portion. We measure to the closest city. But what if, and look, the sages are very intelligent. They said, what if there are two equally close cities? What if they're equally close? Well, here, the two of them bring heifers, according to Rabbi Eliezer. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem never do this with a heifer. Okay, so Jerusalem has a special exception. So clearly we have, now that we work through this text, now the rabbis, as we continue on, what if the head of the corpse was found in one place and the body in a different place? So where do we measure? Do we measure from the head or the body? This is obviously, as you can imagine, a matter of debate. As Rabbi Eliezer says, they bring the head next to the body, and Rabbi Akiva says the body next to the head. So, surprise, rabbis disagreeing. And then what about where on the body should they measure? We already talked about what if there's an equal distance of measurement between two cities, but where are we measuring from? Again, wouldn't you know it, rabbis disagree. Where on the body do they even measure? Rabbi Eliezer says from the navel. Rabbi Akiva says from the nose. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says from the place where they became from the neck. So I don't know how much you're going to get a difference of measurement from the neck versus the nose, but perhaps it makes a difference. Okay. Now, this is interesting. Okay, there's still more here. We're going to go past by this, but there's still more rabbinic conversation even in the Mishnah. Now, what they would do is the elders of that city would wash their hands in water in the place of the breaking the neck of the heifer, and they would recite what we read. Our hands did not spill this blood, nor did our eyes see. But did it enter our minds that the elders of the court are spillers of blood? This is now a really central question about what we read in our Torah portion. Are they actually responsible? Is this what anybody thinks? Rather, they mean to declare that the victim did not come to us, and we let this person take their leave without food, and we did not see them leave without accompaniment. Therefore, the priests recite, "Forgive, Lord, your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, and suffer not innocent blood to remain in the midst of your people Israel." So, this is interesting. They did not have to recite the conclusion of what we read in this week's Torah portion, and the blood shall be forgiven for them, but the divine spirit informs them, when you shall do so, the blood is forgiven for you. So this is obviously really fascinating. There is actually what we see take place here. What the Mishnah here, what the rabbis of the Mishnah are really considering, okay, in this week's Torah portion, we read that there is some sort of implicit responsibility that these elders and judges are taking for themselves, and it's really articulated well here in the Mishnah. Are they actually responsible? Implicitly, there is a responsibility. Rather, maybe there is a sense of responsibility, that maybe a collective sense of responsibility of not escorting them out, not giving them food, and that is really fascinating. Of accepting responsibility where it's perhaps a gray area of responsibility. Clearly, they didn't actually kill this person. We don't know what the situation is there. What we read in this week's Torah portion has to do with not knowing who the killer is. But here in this Mishnah, it says, what if the killer is found before the heifer's neck is broken? Then the heifer shall go out and graze amongst the herd. If the killer is found after the heifer's neck was broken, it should be buried in its place. because it initially came for uncertainty and it atoned for its uncertainty and left. But if the heifer's neck was broken and afterward the killer was found, he is still killed. Okay. Now, then you can see there is certainly more. What about more conditions? What about the killers? I want to share this. This really gets fascinating. From when murderers proliferated, the ritual of the heifer whose neck is broken was nullified. Apparently, there was some point in time, probably in the 1st century or maybe early 2nd century, that the Mishnah is looking back on and said, well, there was a certain point in time that murders increased. So they said, you know what, we're going to get rid of this altogether. Okay, that's a little bit strange. Really set of interesting conversations and wisdom that our sages are sharing from the late 2nd, early 3rd century of the Common Era. Really fascinating. Actually, I will point out some of the rabbis we mentioned were actually from the early part of the 2nd century, maybe even going back to the end of the 1st century. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva are early 2nd century rabbis. So very fascinating takes on these things. For me, what really sticks out is that notion of accepting responsibility. It might be a gray area of responsibility, but yet the elders, the judges, are taking this sort of extra level of responsibility. Very fascinating from these early rabbinic statements. Now, I want to move on to some medieval commentators and see what they have to share with us about this text. So I want to look at 3 early medieval rabbinic commentaries on this week's Torah portion, on this particular section. The first is sort of the prince of all medieval Jewish biblical commentators, Rashi, from the 11th century. Here's what he says. What does this mean? Our hands did not shed blood. Would it enter one's mind that the elders of the court are murderers? No. They declare, we ourselves did not see this person and let them depart without food nor escort, which would have indirectly caused this person's death, leaving this man to the elements. And so Robert's, okay, this is really just a restatement of what we already read in the Mishnah. Rashi actually does this a lot, where he'll restate a midrash, something from the Talmud, and clearly here something from the Mishnah. Now, I want to look at that as Rashi from the 11th century. I want to look at 2 12th century commentators. One is Abraham Ibn Ezra. What does this mean? Neither have our eyes seen it. It is possible that God commanded the city closest to the slain to perform this, because if the city had not committed a similar deed, then the murder of a person near their city would not have occurred. God's thoughts are deep and infinitely beyond our comprehension. Really interesting, but potentially a little bit cryptic. Now I want to move on to Rambam, Maimonides, also a contemporary of Ibn Ezra. And he writes, the beneficial character. Now, this is it's interesting. Rashi and Ibn Ezra write their commentaries. It's sort of these are commentaries on the specific verses and a lot more limited. What the genre of what we're reading here is Guide for the Perplexed by Rambam, by Maimonides. And this is a little bit lengthier of a writing. He says, the beneficial character of the law concerning the breaking of the neck of a heifer is evident. For it is the city that is nearest to the slain person that brings the heifer, and in most cases, the murderer comes from that place. The elders of the place call upon God as their witness, according to the interpretation of our sages, that they have always kept the roads in good condition, to have protected them, and have directed every one that asked his way, that the person has not been killed because they were careless in these general provisions, and they do not know who has slain him. As a rule, the investigation, the procession of the elders, the measuring, and the taking of the heifer make people talk about it. And by making the event public, the murderer may be found out. And one who knows of the murderer, or one who has heard of the murderer, or has discovered this murderer by any due, will now name the person that is the murderer. A little bit reading from Rashi, a little bit reading from Ibn Ezra are interesting in the insights they provide us. Yet, what Maimonides writes here, is so deeply fascinating. It seems to be a purpose. What is all the ceremony about? What is all of these declarations, these responsibilities? What is it all leading towards? It's not just to kill a heifer. It's not what it's about. Maimonides here is arguing that this is ultimately about doing something almost to provoke people to talk about it, to put it into people's minds. What is going on here? Oh, there was a murder committed. Now, of course, if you see someone, you could find a corpse, and that's very terribly tragic and sad, and it being appropriately buried. But does that really do much? Versus, what if there is this action that we read about in our Torah portion to do something? It's an event happening. It's full of sadness for sure, but it's happening. And if it weren't for the sages, it weren't for the judges, it weren't for the leaders, the elders of this town to go and do this fascinating ritual to hopefully expiate the town of sort of a general culpability for this tragic loss of life. But maybe, according to Maimonides, it provokes people to then say, maybe I know who did it. Maybe this person will come forth, or maybe this person, look, ultimately someone is responsible for it. Who takes responsibility? That ultimately is what this entire thing is about. Hopefully there will be someone caught, right? As we saw even in the Mishnah, where there could be, what if you've already brought the heifer and then you discover who the murderer is? But I still find it utterly fascinating that there is this acceptance of responsibility, that maybe we should be thinking about escorting people as they leave town, or providing them food and other provisions for the road, even though if they had had food, would that necessarily have stopped their demise? Unclear. But escorting people out, accompanying them out of town, could have helped prevent their untimely deaths. But who knows? This notion of responsibility for people, even when not necessarily under their sort of responsibility or domain, is certainly fascinating, a sort of an extra step of responsibility. Either way, it is certainly a curious phenomenon, an interesting ritual, and certainly just a fascinating mitzvah, commandment, that we find in this week's Torah portion. And yet we don't often, obviously, do we have towns today that we need to do all these measurements? Probably not, but there are still lessons we can take from this, even just thinking about what we read in the Mishnah, and that got iterated by Rashi, of accepting responsibility, and even what if on a more micro level, right? It doesn't say anything about a micro level. This is all very broad as far as cities and elders, but what if on a micro level we think about, and hopefully no one is risking death here, but when someone's going on their way, providing them with some food or accompanying them a little bit of the way to help them. Really fascinating insights on things that we can do in a more personal micro level of helping people where we can. So, and of course, also accepting responsibility. So who knows? There are things that we don't necessarily think about as our responsibility, but maybe we could step up and provide. So just some interesting thoughts, insights, and more on this perhaps overlooked piece of this week's Torah portion. So I hope this was helpful. Hope this was insightful, and hopefully also interesting as well. Before we go, I just want to thank and acknowledge that all Jewish life and programming here at Majestic Care Cedar Village are due to the support of Jewish Home of Cincinnati. Thank you so much. And with that, I want to say thank you so much for watching, and Shabbat Shalom.